Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look today at the businessmen who became wealthy and powerful in the late 1800s. Because the laissez-faire American economy of the 1800s could allow an ambitious and hard-working man to develop his own business, truly live out one of Horatio Alger's rags to riches stories. But because there were no limits on what a business could do, some of the men who built great businesses were able to build some so large and powerful that smaller businesses were crushed or absorbed or simply could not be created in the first place. So that by the late 1800s, it became much harder for the average American to achieve that new American dream of owning your own business. Now, for much of the 1800s and even into the early 20th century, many Americans did admire these powerful businessmen who, through their hard work and their daring, built these great industries that made America the most productive country on earth and brought affordable consumer goods into many houses. But there were those who felt differently. Smaller businessmen whose lives they ruined. Farmers who depended on their transportation networks and manufactured goods. The workers who labored 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in their factories, began to describe them as robber barons, comparing them to the medieval nobility who used their power to oppress the peasants. Now, there were different ways that some of these captains of industry were able to dominate their markets, or simply to build the powerful businesses they did. One of the main ways was by forming a corporation, which was not entirely a new idea. It's really a development of the old joint stock companies with which the English and the Dutch colonized their colonies in the 15, 16, 1700s. With a corporation, you have a group of businessmen who will put their money together to invest in a new corporation, sharing the costs of forming the company, and of course, sharing the profits through dividends paid based on their share of the company. In addition to sharing the costs and sharing the profits, they also shared the risk. Of course, the risk of the money they invested, but also over the 1800s, and even more so since, the idea had developed that a corporation was a legal person in its own right. Of course, looking back at, say, Dartmouth versus Woodward in the early 1800s, a corporation had sued a state, a corporation in that case being a college. And so, as a corporation came to be seen as a legal person, it meant that the corporation became liable for some big cost. It was the corporation itself that was liable. If a factory exploded and burned down several neighborhoods, it would be the corporation that had to pay it back. And it's true the corporation might be bankrupted by that. And the investors in the corporation would lose their investment in that business. But the courts could not go after their personal property. Whereas if you personally own a business and some disaster befalls and you're liable for a large amount of money, if it's your personal business, the courts can go after your personal property and seize your bank account, your home, your carriage, leaving you only 2 suitcases of clothes, your photo album, and your family Bible. That's all that's protected under your personal property. With a corporation, though, your personal property for the most part is safe. So sharing not just the risk and the reward, but even the liability. Indeed, as the country grew larger and business grew larger, forming a corporation was pretty much the only way to undertake a major product, like building a road, a railroad, or opening a mine, or opening a large factory. And of course, in turn, new inventions like the railroad and the telegraph and later the telephone let these corporations communicate and transport goods across long distances. And so different investors didn't necessarily have to live near each other or their places of business. On the other hand, with transportation communication so widespread, one man or one corporation could control an entire industry. He wasn't limited just to his hometown and the area around it. One of the first, although not the very first, and according to some people, one of the worst of the robber barons, was Jay Gould. He made his first money in the leather tanning business. When some of his business partners had financial troubles, he bought their shares out cheap. Later, he got involved in railroads, particularly the New York and Erie Railroad in New York. And through the railroads, he became involved in the larger economy and politics. There he's shown with Wall Street as his own bowling alley, and he's knocking over all the other interests in town. He also got involved with a business partner, Diamond Jim Fisk. Also involved in transportation and many other industries too. Here we see him not just with his transportation interests, but supplying the soldiers of the Civil War. And two, they got involved in politics, particularly with Boss Tweed, the head of Tammany Hall, the major Democratic machine in New York. As they gave or sold stock cheaply to Tweed, as they also gave him a high-paying position on the board of their railroads to get laws favorable to the railroads passed in New York. Later on, when a number of lawsuits did threaten Gould, he sold his shares in the New York Railroad and began buying up railroads out west, where he cut wages and used his wealth to buy elections in the Great Plains and the Pacific Coast. And also, he was a speculator in stocks, buying stocks cheaply and then selling them when they went up in value, which in and of itself was not a bad thing. But Gould accomplished some of this through stock watering, a term, like many things in the stock market, that originally comes from livestock. In this case, from cattle ranching. Now, if you raise cattle to sell for meat, what is the main thing that determines the price of a cow when you sell it?
How big it is.
How big it is, its weight. And so, one trick sometimes used by cattlemen preparing to sell their cattle is to take them down to the river and get them to drink a whole lot of water right before they're weighed at the market, putting on some water weight, increasing the weight and thus the value of that cow. Of course, the cow will later dispose of his water weight, but he's already been weighed by that point. There are ways to artificially inflate the value of a company's stock too. Some easy ways are simply by lying in your accounting, claiming to have more profits or fewer expenses than you actually do. And Gould was a master of this. Again, stock watering simply means making your company look more valuable than it is to artificially boost your stock price. Gould would do this, sell off the stock, leaving a new owner stuck with something worth much less than they paid for it. Now, in 1869, Gould and Fisk and some much smaller business partners attempted to corner the gold market, tried to buy up all the gold in the United States. Gold, of course, being an important part of our currency, although at this point some paper money and some silver dollars were still circulating. We weren't quite yet on the gold standard. The real reason they wanted to corner the gold market, to gain control of the gold supplies in the U.S., was they hoped that would give them enough influence over the economy to manipulate prices. In particular, they wanted to raise the price of wheat. And this is kind of a complex but interesting idea. If wheat becomes more valuable, what are farmers going to do?
Grow more wheat.
Grow more wheat. Except most wheat farmers were situated in the Great Plains, far from the people who actually eat the wheat. So once you've grown a lot of wheat, what do you have to do?
Yeah, the transport.
Ship it back east. And who owns the trains?
Those people.
Gould and Fisk. So there ain't people to grow more wheat, so they can charge them to transport it. And of course, once all the farmers are trying to ship their wheat back east, they'll jack up the price of shipment. But this got a little bit out of hand as a lot of prices began to fluctuate wildly. Many goods saw their prices skyrocket, the values of many stocks began to fall. But by this point, aside from Gould and Fisk and their associates, there was really only one other group that controlled a lot of gold. And who else had a lot of gold? The U.S. government. And so Gould and Fisk feared that President Grant might start selling off the government's gold supply to get the price of gold back down. Gould tried to bribe the president's brother-in-law to influence the president not to do this, but in the end, Grant did have the Treasury release some of its gold reserves, causing the value of gold to crash on Black Friday in 1869. But while Gould and Fisk weren't able to stop this, they were warned it was happening and also managed to sell off most of their interests in gold before the price dropped. But their minor business partners weren't warned and were ruined. And although Gould and Fisk didn't end up making as much off of this as they hoped, the simple fact they were able to destabilize the stock market and the economy as a whole terrified a lot of Americans. Indeed, after this, many Americans tended to blame Gould and Fisk for any major economic shifts, although after this, they really didn't do anything quite to compare with this. Although there were limits to how much you could criticize them, newspapers who criticized Gould, he would often simply purchase and fire the offensive editor. Even before Gould and Fisk was Cornelius Vanderbilt. Indeed, he was the first to be called a robber baron. He made his money in steamboats and later railroads, in controlling major railroads in the U.S. and overseas. His greatest wealth came from transporting prospective miners from the East Coast to the West Coast during the California Gold Rush. By the time he died in 1885, he was the richest man in America, possibly the world. And for the most part, he was a pretty tight-fisted and mean old man. Although quite late in his life, in a totally uncharacteristic act of generosity, he gave some of his money to a group trying to start a university in Nashville, Tennessee, which of course named itself Vanderbilt in its honor. And their sports team, after his nickname, he commanded so many ships, he was nicknamed the Commodore, at that point the highest rank in the U.S. Navy. In the Second Industrial Revolution, what was the most important industry of all? Steel. And in the steel industry, the most important businessman was Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who really did live out a Horatio Alger story of rags to riches. And he immigrated to America very poor, but he worked hard. He also saw very early on how important steel was going to be to America and the world in the mid-1800s and afterwards. He was also very good at making good friends, other businessmen with whom he could invest, politicians who could pass laws favorable to him. And through hard work, cultivating important friends, and very carefully managing his company, he made it the largest steel company in America, although he never created a monopoly on his own. He always had competition, although he was typically better than them. Partly because he made his company a great example of vertical integration. Vertical integration means owning every step in producing whatever finished good you make. What are the two main raw materials needed to produce iron? Steel. Coal and iron. And so he bought coal mines and iron mines, but he mostly bought them around the western Great Lakes, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, but his steel mills were mostly based in and around Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so that's a long way away. To cut out the middlemen, He bought steamboats and railroads to ship his raw materials to his factories, saving millions of dollars and having complete control over the whole process by buying up every step of it. Other companies, particularly the railroads, formed cartels in which a number of companies would get together and basically agree not to compete. So in a particular region, you might have multiple railroads, but rather than competing and thus driving down the cost of doing business with them or driving up their quality, they did away with competition, again by agreeing not to compete. One common way to avoid competition was through what was then called pooling, but today is more commonly called price fixing. And the owners of the different companies in a cartel would all agree to charge the same price, and thus not compete based on price. Today, of course, this was illegal. In those days, there weren't really many laws restraining what businesses could do. And so this tended to keep prices much higher than they should have been, so that while many people, especially farmers, depended on the railroads, many also hated them. But some companies eventually grew so large they could buy up or simply destroy their competitors, sometimes by lowering prices in one area until local businesses failed, and then jacking up their prices, something they could afford to do because they already made enough money elsewhere. And once a corporation controlled most or all of whatever it did, this became a monopoly and a single company dominating an entire industry. Now, one way this was sometimes done was by having different companies in the same industry entrust their stock to a larger company. So you might technically still have separate companies, but all really controlled by one larger company. And so such a company was called a trust. And typically in the late 1800s, and even today, the terms monopoly and trust tend to be used as synonyms. And that's not quite true. If you get deep into economic business theory, there are some technical differences between the two. There are monopolies that are not trusts. You can have a trust that's not a monopoly. But for normal people, the two terms are used to mean the same thing. And here we see one of the great bankers of the day, J.P. Morgan, reaching out even to control the piggy bank of the little child there at the bottom. Every bank will be entrusted to him, like it or not. Probably the most successful monopolist of this time, maybe all time, was John D. Rockefeller. And Carnegie was successful, but he didn't completely control the steel industry. John D. Rockefeller eventually built his company, known as Standard Oil, into a company so powerful that by 1877, he owned 95% of the country's oil refineries. And partly this was luck. He got into the oil industry just as many people were starting to use kerosene as a source of light in their homes. Also, the growing Industrial Revolution by the early 20th century would start to use oil in the form of gasoline or diesel or other types, for fuel. So he got into it just at the right time, but he also managed his company very carefully and ruthlessly. As his company grew, he told managers in each region that all the oil to be sold there must be sold by Standard Oil. And as they got bigger, they could buy out competitors. Or as they moved into a new area, sell kerosene so cheaply that they were losing money. But they could afford to lose money in one area because they made money elsewhere. But their competitors would either have to sell their kerosene at a loss too, or keep a profitable price, except not make any profits, because Standard Oil kerosene was so much cheaper. They would drive competitors, smaller competitors, to bankruptcy. Once they were gone, they could then raise their prices back up. Although, to be fair, Rockefeller tended to lower prices. He worked out he could make more money by selling very large quantities of kerosene at low prices. So in a way, Standard Oil was good for many consumers, as they could now buy kerosene much more cheaply than they could in the past. But for people who'd owned a rival oil company, their lives were ruined. Other ways he competed that were perhaps a little bit questionable was he convinced many railroads to ship his oil at lower prices than they shipped his competitors' oil. But once his company was big enough, he would say, if you don't ship my oil at a lower price, then I'll simply take my business elsewhere, or maybe just build a pipeline. I'm rich enough, maybe I don't even need to use the railroad. And so he got lower prices on the railroads than his competitors. Or sometimes officially the same price, but then secretly a rebate later. So this practice of owning everything at one level, as he came to own in almost every oil refinery in the country, is known as horizontal integration. A vertical integration is owning things from top to bottom, from start to finish. Horizontal integration is owning everything at one level. In his case, all the oil refineries, although he did eventually vertically integrate as well. Then buying oil wells in America and around the world, building his own pipelines, buying his own railroads. Once people started buying gasoline, he opened his own gas stations, of which the most prominent descendant is Exxon, although in fact several of our modern oil companies came from Standard Oil, but eventually were broken up when laws were passed against monopolies. Although Rockefeller even survived that, he went from owning stock in one big company to owning stocks in several small companies when Standard Oil was broken up, and probably came out richer after the breakup than before. John D. Rockefeller's son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., later compared his family's success to the success of a type of rose called the American Beauty, which produces one very large, beautiful blossom. But the way that's done is as the rose grows, the gardener comes along and pinches off all the buds but one, letting the one bud that's left put all its energy into producing a single, beautiful, long-stemmed rose. And the Rockefellers were brilliant at pinching off their competition while they could. Another very influential businessman of the day was J.P. Morgan. Now, Carnegie had started off poor and become rich. Rockefeller had started off perhaps lower middle class and become rich. Morgan had started off rich and become richer. His father had owned a successful bank in New York City, but Morgan vastly expanded it and used his wealth to buy up other companies, either buying them directly or organizing other bankers in New York to buy them up too. And eventually came to have a lot of influence over many different industries. He was involved in railroads, he was involved in steel, he was involved in many other things, and had the wealth to influence many industries and politicians and others. As we can see here with Morgan pictures the Pied Piper, leading all kinds of Americans on, while the monarchs of Europe look on in envy from afar. During the Panic of 1893, when many companies were going bankrupt, he bought up their stocks cheap while he could, again taking advantage of their misfortune. Although this may not be entirely a bad thing, better perhaps to buy up a failing business and keep part of it afloat than let it collapse completely. One way that he dominated a number of industries was through forming a type of trust described as an interlocking directorate. Of course, corporations have boards of directors. Several men, and today perhaps women too, who each have a vote in company policy. And typically, people who own a lot of stock in a company get to pick at least some of the directors on the board of directors. And as Morgan and his allies would buy up stock in different but similar companies, they would start to appoint members of the boards of directors, even appointing themselves to different boards of directors. So that over time, while they never completely owned these various companies, they would each have a majority of the directors on the boards of directors. So the same group of people was running many different related companies. They might technically be separate, but they were really all working as a monopoly under the direction of Morgan and his associates. Eventually, Morgan had so much wealth that he decided to buy out Andrew Carnegie's company. Carnegie had made so much money, he wanted to spend the rest of his life giving most of it away. Morgan offered him too much money to turn down. Buying up Carnegie Steel and merging it with other steel companies to form U.S. Steel, the first company in America valued at over $1 billion, back when $1 billion was a lot of money. And he bought up other companies over time to make U.S. Steel even larger. Carnegie ended up with about $400 million out of the deal, making him possibly the richest man in the country, maybe the world at the time. Although some people have argued that the emperor of Russia was the richest man in the world, because, you know, he owned Russia, which was pretty big. Morgan was so influential that when the U.S. government began to run low on money in 1895, as the Panic of 1893 was winding down, the President of the United States called on J.P. Morgan, saying the U.S. was about to run out of money, and arranging a loan to Morgan for $65 million in gold. So whereas during the recession of 2008, the U.S. government bailed out the banks, in the Panic of 1893, the banks bailed out the government. Although many people worried about the U.S. government being so deep in debt to a major banker. And then, during the Panic of 1907, he saved the economy again. Yet as many companies were going bankrupt, he again helped to buy up the stock of failing companies, which was profitable for him, but also kept the stock market from crashing as badly as it might have. It did help to keep some companies going, at least partially, as part of one of his trusts, rather than completely collapsing. He would, among other things, buy up an important iron company based in Middle Tennessee and Central Alabama. That we'll look at here a little more in a few weeks. And some people praised Morgan for his success and for saving the Treasury, and others worried about the influence he had over the economy. Now, Carnegie, as I mentioned, decided to spend his last years using his money to improve society. In particular, he wanted to fund libraries, believing that one of the best ways for people to get ahead was through education. At a time when public schooling was often limited or many people didn't have the time to go to school, a library was one way to educate yourself. He also helped to endow colleges, including what would become Carnegie Mellon University, alongside Andrew Mellon, another prominent businessman, which today is a very prestigious college in Pittsburgh. And this generosity was part of an idea that he laid out in an essay called On Wealth, later expanded and known as the Gospel of Wealth. This was the idea that the wealthy should not hoard their wealth. They should use their wealth for the benefit of society. And in particular, by helping people to help themselves, by promoting education. Although he also devoted money to other things, creating, for example, the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace. To try to create world peace, they built 2,500 libraries, but they're still working on world peace. Maybe one day. His influence was so great that some people in Johnson City proposed renaming Johnson City, or maybe setting up another town right next door and calling it Carnegie, in hopes of attracting Carnegie's investment in our local iron industry, or at least getting a Carnegie library built here, neither of which really worked out. Now, another man with a similar idea to Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth was Milton Hershey, who, as you may guess, made his money developing shelf-stable chocolate. Prior to this, people made candies and cakes and things out of chocolate, but didn't keep very long. You had to go down, buy it fresh, and eat it within a day or two. He developed a way to keep chocolate candy fresh almost indefinitely, allowing it to be shipped across the country. People love candy, and he made a fortune. And he decided that his wealth ought to be used to benefit others, what he described as the social gospel. Again, the obligation of a successful capitalist to use his wealth for the good of society. If there's a difference between the gospel of wealth and the social gospel, it is, I think, that Hershey was a very religious man. Carnegie, for the most part, wasn't, although late in his life he found a bit of religion. From Hershey's point of view, this was his moral duty as a Christian. From Carnegie's point of view, it was more a general ethical notion. Indeed, some people also suggested Carnegie was wanting to share some wealth to keep the poor happy so they wouldn't rebel against the power of the rich. Hershey, though, I think genuinely wanted to help people, among other things, setting up an orphanage and an outstanding private school to raise children who had lost their parents at a time when there wasn't much provision for childless young people. Perhaps inspired by the fact Hershey and his wife could not have children of their own. Hershey also made sure the company town of Hershey, Pennsylvania, which he owned, was run for the good of his employees. Even after he died, he required that part of the Hershey Company's profits be used for charity and for the sake of their employees. It does mean that when Hershey's bought up the Reese's Candy Company, they kept it a separate company because that way they wouldn't be required to treat the Reese's employees as well as they did the Hershey employees. That being after Hershey himself was gone. But views like this, the social gospel, the gospel of wealth, were rare, or at most something that came to robber barons later in their life when they'd safely made their pile. Again, in a sense, Rockefeller was right that robber barons were perhaps captains of industry, that they had made society better, reducing competition, and sometimes did let them cut prices, as he did. But in many other cases, it let them raise their prices higher, and certainly made it harder for people who wanted to found a new business to do so. But there were those who viewed this as simply natural. For some, the blessing of wealth was seen as proof of God's favor for these captains of industry. Somebody once asked John D. Rockefeller where his money came from, and he said, "God gave it to me." And to be fair, Rockefeller through his whole life did not drink or smoke. He taught Sunday school every weekend at the Northern Baptist Church and did donate quite a bit of money to what he saw as good Christian causes. Again, the people who owned oil companies he bankrupted might have felt otherwise. But there were those, too, who took a different view. Indeed, some people took both views at different times. As the idea of social Darwinism was developing in the late 1800s, although Darwin himself did not particularly approve of this idea, this application of his theories. But what is Charles Darwin's most famous theory?
Theory of evolution.
Evolution, what drives evolution?
Natural selection.
Natural selection, or survival of the fittest. And he meant this as something taking place over hundreds or thousands of years for creatures in the wilderness. You know, the bird with the strongest beak might crack seeds open better than some other bird. The bird with the longest beak might better pick out insects. And its offspring would spread, passing on its desirable traits. But some people applied this to human society in the short term, and argued that some humans were simply more fit, better fitted for success than others. And so, if some people ended up as homeless children on the streets of New York, or sleeping in cheap hotels for 3 cents or 5 cents a night, 3 cents might rent you a hammock, but maybe not a bed. And other people ended up very wealthy, like John or J.P. Morgan up there on top, about to hit the photographer with his cane for taking a picture without permission. That was simply natural. If anything, there wasn't much point in trying to help the poor. It would be a waste because they weren't suited for success. And that was simply science. And some people applied this idea too, not just within given societies, but between societies and between the races. Meaning that if some races were more successful, that was clearly because they were more suited for success. And here we see the evolution of man, from the baboon to the Australian Aborigine, to the African, to the American Indian, to the Asian, to the civilized European man, who clearly is dressed best and is thus most civilized. In America, this was used by some as justification for discrimination against African Americans and the forcing of Indians onto reservations. As Europeans colonized the globe, this justified in the conquest of Africa, of Australia, the domination of Asia, at least from the point of view of the guy in the lower corner. The other races may have felt differently. Some also justified it from the point of view as civilizing, perhaps Christianizing the world, to lift up, as they put it, these silent, sullen people, half devil and half child. And some took the idea of social Darwinism further yet. The idea of eugenics, Greek for the good race. The idea that just as animals can be made better through selective breeding, a sheep can be made woollier, a cow can be made milkier, a hog can be made fatter. People can be made better too by controlling who bred with whom. Encouraging laws against interracial marriage, and some places even leading to the forced sterilization of criminals or the mentally or physically handicapped. And of course taken to its ultimate extreme in Nazi Germany, to completely eliminating races viewed as inferior. And so there was a sense among many people, although certainly not all, as the charitable and reforming ideas of the Second Great Awakening persisted throughout the century, with many people not feeling that society had any obligation to take care of the working classes. The working class began to organize themselves, increasingly forming unions in the mid and late 1800s, and these unions in turn became not just bigger and better organized, but more active, going further in their demands for better treatment and better wages. And this worried many businessmen and even many middle-class people, of course from the point of view of their own economics, but also philosophically too, as many, although not all unions, were inspired by socialist ideas. Some did resort to violence to try to win better wages and better treatment, and there were some very few, but some capitalists feared a large number who wanted to completely overturn capitalist society in a communist revolution.